Awake. Even the deaf are not signing good morning. Good morning! Okay, yan. My name is Nikki Perez. I will be your program host for today. So, of course, as interpreters, we have a multitude of talents. No? Hidden yung kanina. Hindi ko masyadong ginagawa. Okay. So, dito na ako sa harapan kasi sad behind the podium. It feels so very far away. So, today we're celebrating something very special. Okay? I don't usually dress up or put on makeup, but because today is a special day, diba, for us interpreters, okay, I think it's appropriate that I dress up for the occasion. Kanina, nasa likod kami, we were talking about, sabi ni Sir June Celada of PAIDE, kwento niya na apparently, one of our mga local groups say that today is the day that the
interpreters you come as a sign, as they hold an important role in the country today. The deaf often go to places where people cannot understand sign language. Places, public places, like for example, there is a need for an interpreter to explain how the deaf feel. It's not easy to explain for example, nobody could be patient to read the papers, and so it's easy. It's not easy to explain our symptoms, and when hearing people do not understand our signs, unless we carry paper and pen all of the time, people do not have patience to read our messages when they become necessary. Today is one example. You can understand what I'm saying because you are interpreters precisely. You play a very important role in most places where deaf are a minority group. You try to explain to doctors, for example, how we feel about so they can give proper diagnosis. An interpreter would easily establish communication necessary in such situations. Public forums can likewise show the need for communication between the speakers and the audience. Rarely can we find the deaf people when we move around public places unless we go around specific areas. Interpreters can make life easier for us. They may feel that it's unnecessary sometimes, that maybe we have come to explain that it is our wish that more hearing people will join their ranks to make our life comfortable for us. Thank you in participation.
Applied Studies. And at present, she's the director of Philippine Deaf Resource Center. And also, she's involved as the observer or Philippine Committee for the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability in Geneva, Switzerland. Pwede na po natin siya ipakita. Ready na po?
An interpreting system. First of all, it's important to know that there is a very great need to generate an interpreter pool. The pool of interpreters will come, of course, from training efforts by different interpreter training programs. And these training programs will, of course, have curricula and various materials and resources, which would include teachers themselves. And the whole interpreter training program should be guided by a philosophy or a purpose. So for the training programs, then we would like in the future probably to see that there are particular training programs which are accredited or probably registered, which means that certain standards for the way interpreter training programs are developed would be in place. So through these interpreter training programs, we would create a pool of interpreters, both deaf and hearing interpreters. But of course, there will be some people like CODAs or children of deaf adults who may not have any formal training, but because of their home environments and just growing up with sign language and deaf parents, would actually have very, very strong signing and interpreting skills. Next slide, please. The next slide shows you some of the steps towards the certification of interpreters. From the interpreter pool that I talked about in the previous slide, then it would be important to have linguistically based assessments. So it's important to determine the competencies of an interpreter in 3 different modes. One is for hearing interpreters, it's important to know their competency in a spoken language. This could be English, or it could be Filipino, or it might be another Philippine language, such as Visayan, for instance. The next competency would be in sign language. So this would apply to whether the interpreter is deaf or hearing. And the third competency has to do with actual skills in going to and from the spoken and the sign languages. So this would be the interpretation competency. From the assessments, then there would be certification standards, and there may be general certification standards, and then particular specialized field certification standards, for instance, for legal interpreting or for medical interpreting. Then from there, after they go through the certification process, then you would have a pool of certified interpreters, both hearing and deaf. Next slide, please. In looking at service delivery, it's now important to consider that the consumers or the users of interpreting services may be deaf or they may be hearing. And for deaf consumers, for instance, for legal interpreting, there are certain types of assessment instruments, such as the visual communication assessment for the deaf, which may be utilized. So it's important to always think that the interpreting service addresses a range of different clients. The next slide, this is where I'd like to start talking about professionalism and professionalization. And when we talk about professionalism, in the next slide, this talks about the different perspectives of to whom professionalization would be important. One context is that sign language interpreting is related to local legislation or local policy. For instance, in Congress right now, there is a House bill which has been filed, House Bill 4631, which actually includes guidelines for the hiring, for the conduct of sign language interpreting in courtroom or legal proceedings. So all of those would have to, all of the events taking place in a legal proceeding would have to be consistent with local legislation or policy. Another perspective is when we look at professionalized sign language interpreting is that there is also international law. We are all familiar with the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD. And in the CRPD, there is Article 9, which deals with a general principle in the implementation of the convention, which is on accessibility. And for deaf people, accessibility means that there will be sign language interpreting. And in fact, the state is instructed that it should provide professional sign language interpreters. The next slide continues to look at other perspectives. For instance, why it is important to have professional sign language interpreters. the perspective of other professionals. When you have a sign language interpreter, an interpreter will be found in different kinds of language domains. Therefore, an interpreter will be working with other professionals, for instance, like lawyers, or doctors, teachers, social workers, and so on. So it is important that
lectures, and this particular interpreter now would interpret to a deaf audience. So it was very important, like not just knowing what is being said, but having the right expressions and all. So a sign language interpreter does a lot of things. So my lecture on human rights of deaf people and sign language interpreting would begin with the realization that this is a very, very important topic. And especially when we look at the welfare of deaf people and them needing help, or weak hearing people thinking that they need help. Yes, it's part of the rights of deaf people under the UNCRPD that all persons with disabilities have the right towards communication. So we need to have access to all of these services. So now it's a very different view, really, of how we look at sign language interpreting and how important communication is for the deaf people. So we cannot stick to thinking of persons with disabilities from the point of view of welfare, but to look at it really from the point of view of human rights. So let me show you, that's the picture during our International Deaf Day celebration in Quezon City. Our theme that time was sign language. So, but first let me congratulate also that we are going, this is the first assembly really for the establishment of a national organization for sign language interpreters. So, our history dates back a long, long, long time, but we don't really have a system yet. And so this is really a very significant event that we are now having such an activity. And we do hope that this activity will have an impact on sign language interpreting here in the Philippines. So let me explain to you. Express whatever they have to say using the language that they prefer to use. Okay. So I think Nikki talked about this earlier, the different House bills. So there are 4. But only we're talking or presenting to you now only the 2. I don't know when the other 2 would be presented. There's a lot of debate going on about these bills. But let me talk about the House bill first. This is 4121. Remember, in the Magna Carta, the word there is encouraged. So TV stations are encouraged to have sign language interpreting. The House bill forces them to have sign language interpreting. So all TV stations, all news programs would have sign language interpreting. That's what makes this bill different from the Magna Carta. Now, House Bill 4631, on the other hand, doesn't talk about deaf people in particular, but persons with disabilities in general, and the provision of court interpreters